we are delighted to welcome Allison Levy back for the second part of her Tales of the Palazzo Rucellai. Many of you will have been here in the spring when she gave us part one of House of Secrets. Allison is an art historian at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and had a year-long research fellowship in Florence when she got to live in Palazzo Rucellai, and playing hooky a bit from what she was supposed to be doing, she wound up getting fascinated by the palazzo and doing a lot of research into its history, and wrote a really entertaining and informative book, House of Secrets, which I strongly recommend. And Allison is going to entertain us tonight with further tales from Palazzo Rucellai. So Allison, over to you. Where have you got to? You have to unmute yourself and then speak, and then you'll pop up.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you and we can see you. Perfect. The floor is yours, Allison.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks for the second invitation to come back. This is a wonderful group. It is a wonderful space that I like to use when I'm in Florence, and I hope that I can get back into the building along with all of you before too long. Until then, we'll have to convene virtually, and I'm really happy to tell you much more about Palazzo Rucellai this evening. So let's see. There we go. So as Simon mentioned, yes, the impetus for writing this book was my sabbatical residency in Palazzo Rucellai, something I never could have predicted, but the opportunity sort of landed in my lap and I seized it, and it was quite an adventure. And I really explored every inch, every nook and cranny of this house once I got behind the facade, and it was a fascinating history and set of stories that was beginning to emerge. And so my objective then was not to write a traditional architectural history of the house, but to think of the house as a personality that has existed for over 500 years. And so it's a series of biographies of the residents over these 5 centuries that I present to the reader. And from that, a portrait of the house itself amasses. And what I want to do tonight is to really go deeper into this one life, very eccentric life that played out in Palazzo Rucellai in the early 20th century, and that is of Lazzina Rucellai. And you see her here on the right with one of her Pomeranians. And we will learn much more about her over the next 40 minutes or so. So there is so much to say about Lazzina, and of course about Palazzo Rucellai at that time, that I thought that I would actually read my text, because I wanted to squeeze as much in as I possibly could. Also because there's quite a bit of unpublished content. Some of it appears in my book, but there's still other stuff that I dug up from my notes and my own archive on the house, and much of that is in Lazzina's own voice. And so that's why I also want to read my remarks this evening, and also show you some of those letters, some of her writing as well, as we move through. So, by 1900, the once homogeneous Florentine skyline, punctuated by medieval bell towers and Renaissance domes, had become richly cosmopolitan. Brunelleschi's terracotta-tiled, marble-ribbed cupola now shared the airspace over the Arno Valley with the Great Synagogue, with its large copper dome and Moorish styling, and the Russian Orthodox Church, its onion domes gleaming in iridescent shades of peacock blue, emerald, and goldenrod. Colorful, indeed, was the Russian community in Florence. To me, wrote the British historian Harold Acton, the most strikingly Russian of the Russians was Contessa Lazzina Rucellai. By all accounts, the twice widowed wife of Giulio di Giovanni Rucellai was one of the most eccentric and uncontainable characters ever to occupy the piano nobile of Palazzo Rucellai. Ginger-haired, with impeccable posture, she dominated any room she entered. Her arrival heralded by yipping Pomeranians, Fifi and Felix among them, and a pungent breath of garlic, the elixir she believed capable of sustaining eternal youth. According to Acton, she did not pronounce a word one could not smell. Acton, who was a generation younger than Lazzina, was drawn to the flamboyant redhead, quote, like a magnet. He recalled, though she was at least 70, she set Florentine matrons a good example by whirling into every waltz within earshot. Seeing her marmalade coiffure in the center of a laughing circle, you could be sure that some fun was brewing. Lazzina, in fact, was famous all over Tuscany for her tango teas, glamorous parties held in the Sala Principale during the pre-war years. Local and visiting society alike coveted her summons. And the neighborhood oglers were fascinated to see the beautiful women, the hostess later boasted, dressed to the nines, getting out of their cars in front of our door. Once inside the torch-lit, polka-spewing palace, guests were treated to gluttonous spreads of food and an endless flow of champagne, with as many bottles consumed as smashed on the terracotta floor. And on the right, you see one of her handwritten invitations to a little party. Lazzina's contemporary, Beatrice Niccolini, a Florentine of the same social set, whose sister had married into the family, later waxed lyrical about the aristocratic party scene in the first decades of 20th century Florence. And now I'm quoting Niccolini. There were plenty of balls, all of them with an orchestra, a buffet. We danced the waltz, the foxtrot, the tango, not to mention new dances like the Lambeth Walk, the Bumpsy Daisy, and the Rumba. It was the era of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, of De Sica, Jean Sablon, and Tino Rossi. You never made it home before dawn, and I can still remember the excruciating pain I felt upon leaving, going down the stairs of one palace, then back up the stairs to my very own. My feet were on fire from too much dancing. At the important balls, there was always a midnight dinner. Upon arriving at the house, you were handed a flower, which also appeared in a great bouquet on one of the tables. That's how you found your seat for dinner. Champagne flowed like a river, so too the whiskey. And it wasn't unusual to see some young man smashed or passed out. The women, by contrast, were much more careful. The houses themselves set the mood, because at that time, all the palaces were still private. One of the most famous parties were those held in the house of Contessa Lazzina Rucellai. She was born in Russia, the child of Cossacks. She always recounted having been born in the middle of breakfast, brought to the table, and baptized with champagne. She was the crazy type, and she bickered with all of Florence. Acton fondly recalled of Lazzina, she was fantastic all of a piece. What she left unsaid, her malicious eyes declared. Lazzina recorded many of her legendary anecdotes, originally relayed in French with a sonorous Russian accent, in her unpublished memoir, Souvenir d'une Cossack, a chatty text by turns benign and noxious, which nonetheless takes us deep inside Palazzo Rucellai during the pre-war years, allowing us to mingle with a society high on themselves. Here, Lazzina recounts an encounter on a southbound train to Florence. 3 lovely French ladies entered my compartment. One of them said hello and asked where I was going. I said to Florence. The other asked if I go there often. I told her, very rarely. Then I asked, do you know Florence well? Oh yes, they exclaimed in unison, not to mention all of society. We know the whole world. They began to name a number of my friends and assorted personalities, among others, a Countess Rucellai. At the mention of that name, which is mine, I stopped them and asked if they knew much about her. Her, asked one, she's an ass, the absolute worst. I held my tongue in front of my new rail friends until we reached Florence. Then, as I was getting off and they were continuing on to Rome, I handed them my card, which read, Contessa Rucellai, Palazzo Rucellai, Piazza Rucellai, and added that I would be only too delighted to receive them on their next visit to Florence. Funny, they never told me their names. Well, had Lazzina's rail friends shown up at the eponymous palace and the eponymous piazza, there would have been some confusion. For Lazzina wasn't the only Contessa Rucellai living at that address. By the start of the 20th century, the family had managed to reclaim the piano nobile from renters. Long gone were the Layards, for example, the English family that moved into the house in 1826. So too was most of the art that had once decorated Palazzo Rucellai. Still, two advantageous marriages would infuse the palace with new blood, returning a degree of luster to the dried up edifice and filling it again with little Rucellai. Notably, the grandsons of Giuseppe, the man who first opened up the house to non-Italians, each took a foreign wife. Giulio married Elizabeth Pilar von Pilchow in a Russian Orthodox ceremony in Paris in 1890 and moved his family into the first floor rooms in 1906. Cosimo married the American Edith Bronson in Venice in 1895 and installed his family on the second floor in 1909. Despite, or perhaps due to, Edith's presence in the house, Lazzina made a point of omitting her Christian name from calling cards and letterheads, befuddling hostesses and mail carriers alike, and chafing Edith in the process. Indeed, though each had a floor of her own, the tension between the sisters-in-law was thick enough for Lazzina to hiss, "Family is a disease that never heals." The panacea of choice for both Contessas Rucellai was to mingle among amici. For friendship, according to Lazzina, was like an operable case of appendicitis, rarely fatal. These rival courts of Palazzo Rucellai could not have been more different. Having grown up in Venice, the only daughter of Catherine de Bronson of Newport, who famously entertained Robert Browning, John Ruskin, Henry James, John Singer Sargent, and James Whistler in Ca' Alvisi on the Grand Canal, Edith followed in her mother's footsteps and organized on the second floor of Palazzo Rucellai parties of an intellectual bent. The quiet sophistication of the upper floor gatherings, which attracted local and visiting literary and artistic personalities, contrasted starkly with the raucous, circus-like atmosphere just one floor below, where Lazzina held court over an international crowd of aristo celebrities, wannabes, and cads. Florentine society, Acton cleverly observed, was expansive without being expensive. Guest lists tended to be composed of displaced nobility, vestiges of dissolving empires, pretenders in search of a still active court. Along with aspirants, mostly distant cousins who had married other distant cousins and thus had blown all chances of adding yet another, preferably exotic appellation to their already sesquipedalian monikers. Basically, Florence society was made up of the used-to-haves and the have-nots. And then there were the queer fish. Although Acton was a generation younger than Lazzina, these two born entertainers formed a friendship early on. And in later years, when not presiding over his own salon at Villa La Pietra, Acton spent a considerable number of evenings at Palazzo Rucellai, still under the tutelage of Lazzina, whose mastery of the arts of conversation and amusement had clearly rubbed off on this quintessential aesthete. Acton could play both parts, perfect guest and perfect host, with finesse. Perhaps for this reason, he saw right through his very own set. Every other member of the foreign colony had had a purple past, he remarked matter-of-factly. Though the purple had faded, there was a piquancy in knowing that the suave Lord X had had to flee from the London police because he was a Greek born out of due time, and that the motherly Mrs. Y had been the power behind a throne. As titillating as their histories may have been, the demands of these larger-than-life personalities, Acton explained, burdened many a hostess. Ex-ambassadors and their wives continued to claim the privileges they had enjoyed in their heyday, and since they invariably took the seat of honor, this complicated the problems of hostesses, especially when an acting ambassador was present. And if they were not seated to the right of the hostess, their resentment was heard from the housetops. These purple-stained outcasts, Acton reasoned, must have been drawn to Florence by the knowledge that their pretensions would be respected. For titles roll naturally on the Italian tongue, and almost every foreigner was addressed as Excellency as a matter of course. Not surprisingly, rampant ennobling, Cavaliere, Conte, Marchese, came into vogue just as the boundaries between classes were beginning to blur. But already in the mid-16th century, Giovanni della Casa, addressing Annibale Rucellai in the conduct book Galateo, had ridiculed the then burgeoning practice. And della Casa writes, when men first began to pay respect to each other in artificial, inappropriate ways, and to call each other Lord and Sir, bowing and bending and writhing as a sign of respect, and uncovering their heads and giving themselves exquisite titles, and kissing each other's hands as if they were sacred like a priest's, someone who did not have a name for this new silly habit called it a ceremony. Della Casa warned that this ceremony, so beautiful and becoming on the outside, he wrote, is inside totally empty, without substance, without meaning, as oversized and superfluous as the clothes of a large man placed on a midget. Of course, artifice and folly made for perfect dance parties. And here, Lazzina describes typical goings-on at her tango teas. In need of some distraction, I decided to play a little game on my friends. And so because we Florentines love a visiting star, I announced that I would be having a party to welcome to town a certain Princess Schleswig-Holstein. Someone asked me, was she pretty? I responded that I'd heard it said that she was indeed a great beauty, but that I'd personally never seen her. The evening of my party, the Sala Principale was packed to the eaves, but the princess kept everyone waiting. When her arrival was eventually announced, the guests saw a hideous old hag staring insolently at them through her lorgnette. She greeted no one but for me. She wore a Second Empire-style dress with a long train and a lace headdress over the bunched white hair. I immediately presented her to the notables, among them the prefect of Florence and Principe Sheila Torrigiani. All the men kissed her hand, but the noble German maintained a frigid silence. I also presented her to several of the ladies, but she turned her back on them and walked through the rooms to examine the pictures. All of a sudden, we heard a loud cry. Everyone rushed to the princess, who was having violent convulsions on the floor, kicking up her legs and displaying long white knickers and dirty stockings. Several young people, in spite of her kicking like a mule, managed to carry her to my salotto and to lay her on the couch. There, after a final kick and several somersaults, the dame dropped her disguise. It was Marchese Carlino Torrigiani, the handsome son of Principe Sheila, who in ignorance had previously kissed his hand. The entire party laughed uproariously at the hoax, except for the prefect, who found it offensive to have kissed the hand of such a pretty young boy. So bored and desperate for some distraction, as Lazzina describes it, she found a willing cohort in the pretty young boy Carlino. And the starstruck guests, so caught up in appearances, had fallen for the ruse. That night, the palace rang with laughter, but Lazzina's stage would soon go dark. Here, Lazzina describes a changing landscape. In our good city of Florence, there is a famous street, known for its noble beauty as much as for the chic crowd it draws daily. This street, practically the world's salon, is the beautiful Via Tornabuoni. Nowadays, society ladies completely avoid it, making numerous detours down the poetic but dark little alleys in order to steer clear of what we call the two sidewalks. One of these dreaded places is the very popular Tea Room Doni, where the aesthetes and big spenders congregate. The stylish clientele spills out onto the sidewalk, always blocking the way, and several times a year breaking into a fight. Directly opposite Doni is the Circolo dell'Unione, a venerable and illustrious club whose members, aristocratic and impeccable, gather genteelly on the sidewalk in front of their clubhouse, the former Palazzo Corsi. And if it rains, they take shelter under the carriage door, never losing sight of a single passerby. They hold court like magi, these men, deciding and dishing out the fate of humankind. For instance, if a woman passes in front of them on their sidewalk, they scrutinize her and whisper among themselves, just loud enough to be heard, that one there, che disastro. The poor ladies, shocked and offended, cross the street, only to land upon the playboys at Doni, whose whispers are even louder, their admiration a bit too blunt, their curiosity too uncontained. Several foreign women not familiar with the idiosyncrasies of the two sidewalks were quite put off by this behavior and came to talk to me about it. I explained to the ladies that these days catcalling should be taken as a compliment, that the men obviously find them, let's say, desirable. I did, however, concede that the word disastro is questionable, as it could mean a wreck, a catastrophe, or just plain ugly. They left without saying a word. But ever since our little conversation, they no longer walked down Via Tornabuoni in front of the Circolo dell'Unione, which stands so proud and aristocratic, choosing instead to cross the street, to pass in front of Doni, which is a far less contemptible place. Lazzina's account of the two sidewalks is spot on. Though the haughty members of the Circolo dell'Unione, who stood like magi on one side of Via Tornabuoni, could not have been more different in appearance from the stylish clientele of Caffè Doni, who posed on the other side like shop window mannequins, both sets of bullies had made the passeggiata through the world salon decidedly unpleasant. There were plenty of other important tea rooms around Florence, the Caffè Letterario Paskowski, for example, or Le Giube Rosse, frequented by the futurists, Marinetta, Boccioni, and others. But the most popular place to see and be seen remained Caffè Doni, a vanity fair both inside and out. In the early teens, you saw Rudolph Valentino's by the dozen, Acton recalled, their impassive virility contrasting piquantly with a flashing wristwatch, a sparkle of rings, and a silk handkerchief reeking of Cody. Caffè Doni was, Acton continues, by midday compact with young men oozing infinite leisure, super lounge lizards, buttonholed, brilliantined, and bespattered. These peacocks acted as decoys, enticing wealthier fowl they could pluck and keep on plucking. According to Acton, it was from the ranks of these unemployed Narcissi that Mussolini was to draw his most rabid supporters. From Narcissus to general nuisance, Acton interposed, was an easy step. Indeed, on the eve of the Great War, fashion, futurism, and fascism would collide at full speed, the impact catastrophic. Lazzina here bemoans the events of June 1914, quote, on the advent of fascism. Red Week, as it is called, wasn't simply a continuation of the hardships we'd long endured in Florence, but would prove to be the peak of our suffering. No one could drive around in cars anymore without the occupying forces confiscating them. One day, however, I had the courage to go out in my Mercedes, and some ghastly women threw bottles of ink all over my windshield. Not only that, but at home, we could no longer light up any of the rooms facing Via della Vigna Nuova for fear of having our facade stoned. Someone even set fire to our chapel, where one of our ancestors, Nannina de' Medici, is buried. A mere stable separates our palace from that chapel. The firemen were called, but to no avail. They arrived 40 minutes after we'd been rescued by a group of young fascists who, though only children, were our real heroes. They climbed up onto the roof at the back of the palace and fought the fire with axes while the flames leapt at their feet. As for the firemen, well, there was little left for them to do by the time they finally arrived on the scene. That night, I spoke with my major domo about the incident, and when I mentioned my admiration for those heroic children, he replied, "Saved you? Everyone knows perfectly well that those are the little fascists who set the fire." Not only he, who has worked in our house for the last 20 years, but everyone out in Palazzo Rucellai and in all of the streets that surround the palace said the same thing. Around that time, an old woman who sells cigarettes and is very tight with our staff stopped me in the street one day to ask why we no longer throw big parties. She added that everyone in the neighborhood regretted it because it had always been so fascinating for them to see the beautiful women dressed to the nines getting out of their cars in front of our door. I told her that, having been ruined by the Bolsheviks, we could no longer entertain on such a grand scale. Another time, while leaving the palace at dusk, I was accosted by a fairly well-dressed man who, shaking his fist in my face, screamed at me, "If you think that you will live in this house a long time, you are mistaken. We will chase you out of it, and we will be the masters." Some of my servants were seated on the stone bench, which, as was the style in the Quattrocento, decorates the facade of the palace. Not one of them got up to defend me, but as I knew from experience, one gets further with laughter than with force or rage, so I sneered in the face of this thug, gave him 10 lire, and told him to drink to my health. He accepted the money without concealing his delight, and in return offered to accompany me on my walk. I certainly did not want to seem afraid of him, and so even though it was getting dark, I accepted his invitation. Luckily, an old doorman who works in a neighboring house followed me step by step and said, "I will not abandon you, and I've warned the secret police across the street. I know them well." That charming promenade lasted just a few moments before 4 officers in civilian dress seized my cavalier, handcuffed him, and began to frisk him. They pulled out of his pocket a very long and frightfully sharp knife, which he later confessed had been destined for me. So I'd been rescued by a poor little porter whom I barely knew, while my minions, chauffeurs, and carriage drivers, who'd always appeared so devoted, didn't so much as budge from the banco in front of the palace. Lazzina spells out in no uncertain terms exactly where her loyalties lay. Quote, "With my savior Mussolini," the passage continues, "who delivered us all from mortal danger." This vexing text also provides a much appreciated account of Palazzo Rucellai and its suffering during Red Week. What would Alberti have thought of the fact that the family could no longer light up any of the rooms facing Via della Vigna Nuova for fear of having the facade stoned? One now wonders if the chips and pockmarks of the Pietraforte veneer, once attributed to time and neglect, were also caused by violence, by anarchy, by revolution. And aside from the attacks, what would Giovanni Rucellai have thought about the invention of electricity? What better way to show off his palace, to highlight the family jewel? Alas, his ancestors, despite having managed with difficulty to keep the house going for nearly 500 years, were now forced to turn off the lights, to shutter the Sala Principale. Lazzina provides no details on how Palazzo Rucellai fared during the war beyond this, but the family seat was still standing on Armistice Day. The shutters of the Sala Principale were reopened. The electricity turned back on, but the light within was dim. After the war and the Russian Revolution, Lazzina, having become, in her own words, nothing more than a poor Cossack, no longer had the means to entertain as she once had. And I'm quoting Lazzina. One day in 1927, my cousin, Prince Felix Yusupov, the famous assassin of Rasputin, came to lunch at our house in Florence with his wife, the beautiful Grand Duchess Irina of Russia. Just as everyone was being called to table, he pulled me aside and asked if he could leave something in my salotto. He reached into his pocket and took out a small jewelry box. I asked him what was inside. Oh, he answered nonchalantly, it's only a pair of earrings, the last gift from Louis XVI to Marie Antoinette. Open it. They were a marvel. 2 pear-shaped drops encrusted with diamonds. Very fashionable, my cousin told me, at the end of the 18th century. I don't know what to do with them, he said. They cost $1 million. I told him exactly what to do with them. Put those back in your pocket at once. Ever since the Bolsheviks ruined me, we have too few servants to leave jewelry like that unattended, especially in a room so far away. The 2 pear-shaped drops encrusted with diamonds had in fact belonged to the guillotined Queen of France, though the circumstances of when and how they left her possession are unclear. At one point during the French Revolution, she is said to have sewn them into her bosom. The earrings remained in the French royal family for nearly a century. In 1853, Napoleon III presented the marvels as a wedding gift to Eugénie de Montijo, but 20 years later, following France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the couple's subsequent exile to England, the last empress consort of the French was forced to sell them. The diamonds, weighing 14.25 and 20.34 carats, respectively, were then acquired by the Grand Duchess Tatiana Yusupov of Russia. It was her grandson, Felix, who would reveal them to Lazzina on the piano nobile of Palazzo Rucellai. That he was not sporting the earrings himself is somewhat surprising, given Felix's long-time penchant for cross-dressing. At the age of 12, he recollected, I began to lead a double life. By day, I was a schoolboy, and by night, an elegant woman, wearing on one occasion a dress of blue tulle embroidered with silver and a headdress of ostrich feathers in several shades of blue. To complete the effect, I wore my mother's well-known jewels. On an icy winter night, a diamond-bedecked young woman in a ball dress passed rapidly through the streets of St. Petersburg in an open sleigh. Later on, when I was old enough to take an interest in women, life became even more complicated. Although I felt much attracted to them, my numerous love affairs never lasted long because, being accustomed to adulation, I quickly tired of doing the courting and cared for no one but myself. The truth is, I was a horrible little beast. I liked to be a star surrounded by admirers, doing whatever I liked. I thought it quite natural to take my pleasure wherever I found it, without worrying about what others might think. Felix's self-centered approach to romance equally colored his outlook on politics and palace intrigue, as indicated by his 1953 retelling of his role in the 1916 assassination of Rasputin. the controversial spiritual healer and member of Tsar Nicholas II's court. The two men had met nearly a decade earlier when Felix, then a student at Oxford, was visiting his parents in St. Petersburg for Christmas. He walked up to me, said, "Good evening, my dear boy," and attempted to kiss me. I drew back instinctively. He smiled maliciously. From the very first, his self-assurance irritated me. He looked like a lascivious, malicious satyr. Over the years, Felix's disdain for Rasputin's growing influence over Tsarina Alexandra only intensified until, on December 16, 1916, the 29-year-old heir to pre-revolutionary Russia's greatest fortune invited Rasputin to the Yusupov family palace, and there, in an elegantly outfitted basement room, plied his satyr with poisoned wine, then shot him. Our hearts were full of hope, for we were convinced that what had just taken place would save Russia and the dynasty from ruin and dishonor. On the contrary, Felix was immediately placed under house arrest and soon thereafter banished from St. Petersburg. 3 months later, the Tsar and his family were brutally murdered. Felix and his young family managed to flee Russia, but not without first retrieving 2 Rembrandts. Unframed and rolled up, he explained, the paintings were easy to carry. And far more valuable than the Rembrandts, his mother's jewels. In order to finance his Parisian exile, he was forced to sell the paintings early on. The American collector Joseph Widener, future benefactor of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., purchased Portrait of a Lady with an ostrich feather fan and Portrait of a Gentleman with a tall hat and gloves in 1921. But the diamonds and other jewels Felix clung to as long as he possibly could. Indeed, he still had the earrings when he visited his cousin Lazzina in 1927. By the following year, however, the prodigal prince, if he was to keep caviar on the table, had no choice but to part with his family's most precious heirloom. Pierre Cartier bought Marie Antoinette's pear-shaped earrings in 1928, and in October of that same year sold them to Marjorie Merriweather Post, owner of General Foods Corporation and the wealthiest woman in the United States. In November 1964, Mrs. Post's daughter donated the earrings to the Smithsonian Institution. Catching a glimpse of the sparkling diamonds in Palazzo Rucellai, Lazzina surely pined for her lost imperial lifestyle. The salonière may have been forced to scale back her court, but she refused to abdicate her throne. "We are pompous and grandiose in Italy," she declared. "The breath of our palaces seduce us, and there is a certain harmony between us and these old walls." Thus, the frayed yet unflinching Contessa, buttressed by the fortitude of what she called the antique Rucellai citadel, simply decamped from the Sala Principale to her private salotto, a room in every sense so far away. There, this remarkable survival of an extinct regime hosted intimate gatherings for the pre-war faithful. Members of that inner circle included Gabriele D'Annunzio and Harold Acton, whom she affectionately called ce cher Chinois. The room, one of the smallest in Palazzo Rucellai, Acton recalled, was crammed with preposterous stuffed pets and gewgaws. She was spacious even in her tiny boudoir, straight as a column and as vivacious as her marmalade coiffure. Unfortunately, he divulged, the Bolsheviks had given her such a scare that she imagined they were ready to pop out on every side of her. And yet, from behind the door of her garlic-infused boudoir, under the glass eyes of her stuffed Pomeranians, Lazzina, now nearer 80 than 70, upheld her salacious reputation. And this is Lazzina. No Europeans have the virility of our Cossacks, she would add, scrutinizing a tired young man through her lorgnette. We can do without sleep. We carouse and make love as long as there is any breath in us. What we call parties, you call orgies. You simply can't live up to them. Lazzina's inexhaustible libido intimidated all but one, the equally insatiable D'Annunzio, the poet-prophet of the decadent movement in Italian literature. These fellow nonconformists forged a friendship in Paris well before Lazzina settled in Florence, and their bond continued to sustain her through the Tuscan years. D'Annunzio rebaptized Lazzina Mona Lisa degli Auricellari, a reverential nod to the Rucellai gardens, the Orti Auricellari, one of the most important literary, philosophical, and political stages of the early 16th century. His disciple obeyed, signing her letters to him, the sorceress of the gardens. Though the property had passed to the Venturi Ginori-Lisci family, Lazzina still considered it her own. The sorceress of the gardens wasted no time in forming a society of like-minded friends who gathered, perhaps with some trepidation, whenever the enchantress summoned. And I read a passage from this letter that I'm showing. For different reasons, frivolous and fleeting, the presence of the illustrious members of the glorious garden is kindly requested in the intimacy of elite spirits for a night of orgies. Mona Lisa degli Auricellari plants a spiritual kiss on those foreheads pulsating with ideas on the eve of the mystical night, while Lizine Woronzov-Shuvalov, wife of Giulio Rucellai, awaits you with her madness this Thursday evening. Ave Hospes. Lazzina's double sense of self, a sort of now and then persona, is noteworthy, as is her self-diagnosis of madness. The invitation is dated 29 January 1407. Was this recording of a 15th century date merely a slip of the pen, or was she channeling an adopted ancestor? Lazzina, herself frivolous and fleeting, finally ran out of breath in 1936. She was buried on the outskirts of town in the Cimitero degli Allori, the 19th century cemetery for foreigners. Her stage, once again, was dark. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Allison. Yes. And there's a picture of Allison in her book. Here we all are. Thank you. That's everyone invited to now join the discussion with any questions or indeed observations that you may have. And I think we'll follow our normal protocol that if you have a thing you want to say, just unmute yourself and say it. So the floor is open. I'll start with one. I'm very interested in this complex dance between high society and fascism in the early part of the 20th century. Not least, I guess, because one of my illustrious predecessors, Harold Goad, who was director of the British Institute in the 1930s, and the British Institute in those days was very much integrated with the high society of the international scene in Florence, and Goad was a full-blown fascist sympathizer. He published pamphlets in praise of fascism. It's a complex interface, and I just wondered whether you had any further insight into how that played out. Well, I mean, Lavinia was too old, and she died when it all came up, before it all came to pieces. But did you know anything much? Have you looked closer at that particular interface?
Well, you're right. It is a complicated story to tell, and the text that I cited from, this is Lazzina's personal memoir. It was a vanity press publication, so there were just a few copies that were made and are in circulation, but it was it is very raw material there. So I mean, she was prone to exaggeration and you know, spinning tales, but I think that it does present for us a glimpse into her mind anyway, and what was happening in Palazzo Rucellai. I doubt that what happened in Palazzo Rucellai was unique among that set. So I think we can take a lot from her writing and imagine similar events and conversations happening in other aristocratic houses in Florence at the time. In my book, my story sort of stops here with the death of Lazzina, and I don't pick up again with happenings in the house until the late 20th century, with the murder of an aristocratic resident, Alvise de Robilant. So I can't speak beyond what I know was happening in Palazzo Rucellai, but again, that was certainly not a unique space where this kind of activity was playing out. And I have my facsimile copy actually on a table over there, so I can't reach for it, but it's quite thick, and she says much more than what I read today. So it really is a very interesting voice. It is a vexing text. I think she is a noxious personality, a very difficult, you know, she was fascinating, but difficult to write about. And even as I was reading these lengthy passages, I was cringing, I admit, because it is you know, I'm not endorsing her politics, but I think it's very important to understand what those politics were and how they played out in Florence at the time, and certainly beyond. Yeah, I think it's something that is still being grappled with. I think, you know, more such voices, if they're revealed, I think would help us fill in a number of gaps in that history.
I'm going to continue the conversation, but please, anyone else jump in if they want. Do you know, and does anyone else on the Zoom know where Howard Acton was sitting and all of that? Because it's you were stressing that he was a big friend of Lavinia's, and I imagine he would have been friends with the Mitford sisters, who were other well-known fascist sympathizers, this time with the Nazis in the 30s. So do we know anything about where Howard's thinking was in the 20s and the 30s as the storm was starting to gather?
I really will open that up to the audience, because I'm sure you all will know more on Acton. I did quote a lot from his memoir, his two memoirs. So he was, his parents were frequent guests to the house. He, of course, formed this friendship, very close friendship with Lazzina, and trying to think about, you know, there too, there are other passages in those memoirs where he writes about her activities and sort of mood at that house, but about Acton personally and what may have been happening at Villa La Pietra, I haven't studied that, so I can't say.
I don't know whether Mark's here, because he would probably know the answer, Mark Roberts, but anyone know anything about that? Or indeed, have anything else they'd like to ask about? Penny?
I know that he wrote a biography of Nancy Mitford, and he seemed to be very friendly with her. And I think she was rather more on the other side than the one that went off to stay with Hitler in Germany.
Yeah.
I don't know if that gives any clues.
No, I think, yeah. I mean, I think you see part of the problem, of course, is we all know what happened next, but in the 1920s and early 1930s, maybe people did see this as a good idea. We have echoes of what's going on in the world right now, I fear, but perhaps we won't go there. So, any other thoughts, questions, or comments from anybody? Just unmute yourself if you have anything you'd like to contribute. If not, we can move towards a close because we're near the top of the hour. It was a.
I'd like to compliment her on a very, very well done lecture. I enjoyed it very much. She speaks very well and kept us very engaged. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. I appreciate it. I was telling Simon before we started this evening, it really has been enjoyable for me to put this together because the book was published last year, and in this most recent spell, I've been very busy with other projects, and so haven't been thinking about Palazzo Rucellai as much as I have in the past. So it was really nice to re-enter that space and that world. And you know, I am an art historian. Simon mentioned that in the beginning, and my specialty is the Renaissance. So I came to Palazzo Rucellai as a Renaissance art historian, very, very familiar with the facade, but really nothing else because it is a private home. And to me, these later stories and histories and events that I began to study once I was in the house to explore and discover was really very fascinating. And I think it's important for us to also think about these Renaissance monuments as having, of course, the afterlives, but in this particular case, as this conversation has been going around politics and, just really some of the behaviors and the events and activities that happen behind these facades, that Lazzina refers to Palazzo Rucellai as the antique Rucellai citadel. I think that sense of the house as a fortress is very strong. And of course, the, stoning of Alberti's facade is a remarkable, just really remarkable commentary. And, we tend to think of that facade as this icon of Western architecture that we typically encounter in a textbook, but to think about the abuse that it was taking, that it was a political stage is just really an important thing to remember. Of course, most of you are in Florence and walking by these monuments and living with them, but it's just a good reminder of the many lives. That is the subtitle of the book, The Many Lives of a Florentine Palazzo. So lots of layers.
And I think the stoning is interesting, not least because it's testing out one of the features of 15th century palazzo architecture, which was they were built as fortresses. I mean, if you look at Palazzo Rucellai or Palazzo Strozzi up the road, they were certainly effective as defensive formations for the big families at times of civil unrest. So it stood up to that test again 400 years later. It was great.
Yeah.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions?
I just have a quick question, if I may.
Please, sir.
Fascinating talk. I didn't know about her, and I'm very interested in her because I also am of Russian origin, of a family that did live in Florence. And so I was just curious to know what her maiden name was.
Pilar von Pilchow.
Doesn't sound very Russian indeed.
No, but she was twice widowed, and those husbands were Vorontsov and Shuvalov. And,
okay.
and I've not studied Russian history, and I really had to do my best when I encountered Lazzina. And Lazzina Rucellai is not a name that comes up readily, and certainly has not before my book been connected to Palazzo Rucellai, to the house in any publications. And so I had to do my best to try and understand who she was. And there's so many variant spellings of her name. And we don't have an exact birth date for her. I have that one photo that appeared over and over again that appears in the Venucci volume on what is it? I think it's called Foreigners in Florence or something, one of those books maybe from the early 60s. That's the only photograph I've been able to find. There is a fair collection of her letters and telegrams in the Monticelliana. So at the end there, the invitation to the Rucellai Gardens, that's something that I came across a couple of years ago in that archive. And in fact, I'm glad that question came up because it leads me to this. I forgot I had a prop. This is the handwritten letter, sort of loose invitation to an unnamed Marchese that I showed at the beginning with her signature on the back. And believe it or not, I found this on eBay. But it's very charming, and there's this tiny embossed Rucellai seal at the top, really tiny. So I really had to dig deep to try to put together a portrait of her. And then of course, so Acton writes about her, that was invaluable. And then there's her memoir. And I could have written a whole book. Someone will, I hope, write an entire book about Lazzina and translate that memoir in full. It's written in French. And of course, I only extracted the pieces on Palazzo Rucellai. But believe it or not, I made that discovery that this even existed in the New York Public Library after I'd left Florence. And I had a microfiche copy that was nearly impossible to read. And then that's when I realized that there was a copy in Florence. Where is it? At the Visu. And it was badly damaged in the 1966 flood. And I remember putting in my request, of course it was off-site, and they said, oh, well, this might not come back because this may not have survived the flood. So for 3 very nervous days, I was waiting in Florence to see if it would appear, and it did. And it still has the mold from the flooding, and it's a small book, and there's a little bit of marginalia, as I recall, almost like copy editing that was done in pencil. So, you know, there are pieces of her. If you're looking for Lazzina Rucellai, there is a presence. You just have to sort of connect the dots. But it wasn't easy, but I think it was well worth it, because as difficult as she is as a character, we learn a tremendous amount from her. And so, and surely I think I would have enjoyed attending one of those parties with the champagne flowing like a river.
Very good. Okay. We're getting beyond the top of the hour now. So unless anyone's got something they want to contribute, we'll probably wind it up. Allison, thank you very much for another fascinating talk. And have a think about what you might want to do if you came back again sometime next year. Either hopefully in Placentia one of these days, but if not, we'd love you zooming in from Rhode Island. I have to end with my traditional appeal to ask you if you would be so kind as to consider making a donation of whatever size you feel comfortable with to our Just Giving site. Sarah's going to put the link up on the comments. We do need your help at this time, because you can imagine with the library and the school closing again tomorrow, we are hemorrhaging money. But we will persevere, we will survive. But anything you can do to help is greatly appreciated and much needed at this time. Look forward to seeing you all next week. And for those who are interested in the contemporary story, there's Firenze now tomorrow evening as well. Next week is Alan Pascuzzi talking about goldsmithing in the Quattrocento. And see you all then. Have a great evening. And for the Americans on the call, good luck.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.